this evening. The purpose of this hearing is to allow me to receive evidence and testimony on the matters that are pending. I make a recommendation only to the county commissioners. I do not make the final decision. I will be submitting my recommendation to staff within 2 weeks of this evening's hearing. The application will then be scheduled for deliberations before the county commissioners. If you wish to give testimony, I need you to fill out one of the sheets in the back, and when you come to the podium, please give your name and address for the record before you begin your testimony. First, staff will introduce each application, then we will hear from the applicant. After the applicant's testimony, we will then get into the public comment sheets. We will hear from those who are in favor, those who are neutral, and then those who are opposed. The public not speaking will be read into the record. We will then give the applicant and/or their representative an opportunity for rebuttal of any testimony stated into the record from the public before we close the public hearing. After that point, we will receive no more testimony. The time limits are 30 minutes for the applicant's presentation, 3 minutes for public testimony, and 15 minutes for applicant rebuttal. I would ask that you direct all of your testimony to me and not to the audience. Are there any questions regarding these proceedings? Not seeing any, we will move along. Our first case this evening is case ZON 22-0006.
Good evening, Madam Hearing Examiner. For the record, Vlad Finkel with Kootenai County Community Development. Before I get into the specifics of this first request tonight, I'd like to say that this application has been very challenging for staff to assess because of the complexity and a lot of discretionary measure that staff as well as other agencies could take. There are some cases that we process that are more black and white where you meet the applicable letter of the law and you have the appropriate findings. In this case, we find that there's a lot of room for interpretation. As you know, our obligation as a department to provide the most accurate and professional recommendation that will benefit the community as a whole. So I just wanted to kind of do that introduction before I get into the specifics of this request. This is a case number ZON 22006 by Mr. Condon. And the request in this case is to rezone a 3-acre or 2.97 acre parcel of land from commercial with a conditional zoning development agreement, short would be CZDA, to straight commercial. Oh, not sure what's going on. The subject property is located on the northeast corner of Huetter Road and I-90. It is surrounded by parcels of various sizes. You can see you have a residential development directly to the east. You have a large undeveloped tract of land that was recently purchased by Huetter and has been annexed this past spring. I believe they're currently going through a master plan analysis for a big multi-family or mixed-use development project. I do want to make it clear in the record that we have some inaccurate maps that were perhaps exhibited in the staff report for your review because they're lacking the change in the zoning and the comp plan designation based on the most recent change. We actually had to go back to our GIS department and request that that change be made consistent with the most recent annexation. Unfortunately, it takes sometimes up to a year to make those changes. So we had to do that recently, but I do want to make it very clear that the property is currently abutting City of Coeur d'Alene to the north and to the east. You have commercial to the west, and then you have agricultural suburban to the northwest, as well as, well, actually that wouldn't count I-90, but anything south of I-90 would be commercial. The comp plan designation is border on the subject parcel of land, and everything that is due west, and there is a portion that's transitional northwest, and everything south of I-90 is border. The subject property is located within the area of city impact of City of Coeur d'Alene. This Huetter corridor is actually where the ACI for the City of Post Falls as well as City of Coeur d'Alene meet. So everything that is west of Huetter Road is within the City of Post Falls area of city impact. The property is located over the Rathdrum Prairie Aquifer, and as you may know from previous hearings, there are strict regulations for the amount of effluent discharge that can be discharged within a 24-hour period. By today's standards, everything over the aquifer can have a maximum density of 1 dwelling per 5 acres. However, those parcels that were created prior to, I believe, 1977, if I'm not mistaken, are grandfathered by Panhandle Health District. The current conditional zoning development agreement has specific sideboards with respect to what currently can be operated on site. In 2014, the applicant got an approval to rezone the property from agricultural suburban to commercial with a conditional zoning development agreement to operate, and I can read this into the record, but basically they were looking to have a small maritime business where they would be constructing docks and other structures for a dock, for a business, for a maritime business. They were to have a maximum of 6 employees on site with some vehicles that would, some commercial vehicles that would be utilized on a daily basis to bring material back and forth from the site. One of the conditions, or not one of the conditions, but one of the provisions of the CZDA is that in the future, if the applicant, if it was possible to annex the property, the applicant would not object to annexation into the City of Coeur d'Alene because it's within the area of within the Coeur d'Alene area of city impact. These are some of the most recent photos that we came up with. The applicant originally submitted some photos from last winter. The site was covered in snow, so I figured that more recent photos would be more appropriate. There's an existing residence and a garage, and I think there are some lean-tos or structures that have walls on at least two-sided or maybe three-sided on site that were previously used for storage. The photos at the bottom of the slide show the property off of I-90. The photo in the in the right corner is heading west on I-90. You do have a vegetative buffer along I-90, and this is another Google area photo looking east at the site. You have Huetter corridor in this location, and you have the primary entrance to the site in this location. All of the equipment has been removed from the property. I don't believe there's anything there at this point because the applicant has recently sold their business and they're actively not operating anything out of that site. So it's been a vacant property for the last probably 6 months or so. Perhaps the applicant could clarify when that business was removed off site, if that makes any difference in your review. During the agency comment period, we solicited comments from all the agencies with jurisdiction. It appears that none of them had any concerns with the exception of City of Coeur d'Alene. We have gone back and forth with the city official, and the planning department director, Hillary Patterson, submitted at least on two different occasions a response that they did have concerns with the elimination of the zoning development agreement that would allow for a myriad of commercial uses on site, although they may be bound by the amount of wastewater discharge that can be created or generated due to the property being over the aquifer. But because the applicant does not have any future use in mind at this time, it's hard for staff to contemplate what could perhaps be one of the uses. They did bring up a proposal a few months ago to potentially lease the site to a dealership. Upon review of what the proposal was, I think it was like a car sales dealership, we concluded as a department, along with our legal counsel, that the scope of operations on site and the impacts, including traffic, the number of employees, and so forth, customer traffic, would generally be greater than the previous use that was on site, specifically approved through the zoning development agreement. So it goes along the same lines with what the city officials said, is if the zoning development agreement is removed, the uses basically could be endless as long as they could meet Panhandle Health District requirements. But that still doesn't alleviate the concerns with respect to compatibility analysis and other impacts such as aesthetics, noise, traffic, and so forth. So we, as a department, felt that the comments from the city of Coeur d'Alene were appropriate, and we did side with the concerns that were brought up by the city official. During the public comment period, we didn't have any comments in opposition of the request. It's pretty rare, but it does happen. It doesn't appear that anybody had any interest in seeing the change that the applicant is proposing. We did have extensive analysis. I don't know if I need to read through this. I have it on my screen, but we did have a number of concerns, some of which were that without a defined future use, it's unknown whether or not the use will be compatible with adjacent residential uses in the immediate area. Moreover, the elimination of the zoning development agreement and reliance on the special notice permit to address potential impacts and adequate infrastructure improvements on site is not an appropriate solution. In 2014, when the property was originally rezoned, the area has evolved, making commercial use directed into the city an imperative rather than remain in the unincorporated area of the county, specifically being that Huetter recently purchased the property and was annexed directly to the north of the subject property. We find that the removal of the CDA would be in conflict with the ACI agreement, with the intensification of the use at a future date versus keeping it as a low intensity so that it could be easily annexed into the city limits. And the final one, of course, is that it would not be compatible with the comp plan designation. The removal of the CZDA would facilitate a myriad of more intense commercial uses on site, contrary to the primary purpose of the border designation. So having said that, we felt that it was important for staff, because of our position to recommend denial of this request, that we looked at possible avenues for either the applicant or the hearing body to consider. And we did come up with 4 different options. The first one of which will be to retain the zoning development agreement on site, and for the applicant potentially to request a new use that would be equivalent in nature and impacts. The second one, of course, would be to revise the conditional zoning development agreement to perhaps something more intense. That, of course, would have to go through a special notice permit, but the special notice permit on its own doesn't resolve all the issues of potential impacts. The third option is perhaps to consider rezoning the property back to the prior zoning designation of agricultural suburban, because the CZDA was originally approved for a specific use. If that use is no longer actively being pursued on the property, then what is the point or the benefit of having that commercial zoning designation with a zoning development agreement? Because if they weren't actively seeking it in 2014, the zone change would have never happened. And of course, the last one, which we believe is to be the most appropriate one, is having the applicant annex the property into the city of Coeur d'Alene, as suggested by the city official as well as the provision that was stated in the original zoning development agreement, which the applicant did state that they would be open to annexation at a future date. With that, I don't have any additional information for you tonight unless you have questions for me.
Not right now. Thank you,
Okay.
Vlad. Rand.
I've got a PowerPoint that Vlad's gonna get pulled up there for me. Cool. And I should be able to control it from here, correct, Vlad? Okay, great. Thank you. Rand Wickman for the record. Oh, I'm controlling it already and I didn't even try. Sorry, 2992 Gotham Bay Road, Harrison, Idaho is my address. I'm pleased to be here representing the John and Gayla Condon Living Trust on this request. We've got a little bit of repetition here, so because of Vlad's presentation. So I'm gonna skip through some of this early stuff. And thank you, Vlad, for your presentation. So you know where the property is. We'll zoom in on it a little bit here. The important part of this is to recognize, you can see where the property is pretty well ringed with trees. On the east side over here, there is, that's about 200 feet of buffer between this building and the closest house here. There's a ravine that runs down here. The property line's about in the bottom of the ravine, and there's about 100 feet of trees on either side of that. Of course, no guarantee that the stuff on the other side of the property line stays. Those property owners could do whatever they'd like with their trees, but we got a pretty good buffer to the east between the residential use and this property. The zoning, Vlad touched on this as well. I just added with those fantastic graphic capabilities of mine, added these, the zoning designations from the recently annexed Huetter project. So this area here, the existing residential development here is zoned R3. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Huetter project in a minute. But they did, they had a R3 buffer that they put around the perimeter on both the south and the east sides of that project. There's a section of R8 zoning to the north of that. And then along the Huetter frontage, it's R17. As you get a little further north up here, then they have their C17 zoning for that project. And so the only other thing I would point out related to this slide is that you can see we have a conditional zoning development agreement. All this other commercial across the way, none of that has a CZDA attached to it. A little bit of history on the site. Again, Vlad touched on some of this. The main structure on the site was built as a house in the ag suburban zone back in 1986. That was back when I-90 carried a small fraction of the traffic that it sees today. In 2014 was rezoned to commercial with a CZDA. That was followed by a special notice permit in 2016. All of that was done to facilitate the use of the site by North Idaho Maritime, and as Vlad indicated, that business sold was about a year ago now, maybe a little more. I think it was early fall last year when that business sold, and the new owner relocated the business to their operation, which is elsewhere. They're kind of scattered about, but they're elsewhere. And so the owners do still currently use the site for their other business interests. John tells me he gets to the site just about every day during the week, and they do have a little bit of a presence there, but it's certainly not as obvious as it used to be when North Idaho Maritime was there. And that house on the site, as part of North Idaho Maritime's operation, was converted to an office. And so it might look like a house from the outside, but it doesn't look much like a house from the inside anymore. So over the last several months, as Vlad indicated, we've worked with staff to better understand the restrictions that come from the current agreement. And as is so often the case, these things are never as clear or as explicit as you'd like them to be. But kind of what we came up with through our email exchanges and discussions were that the CZDA restricts the site to uses like contractor office or storage or professional, commercial, or government office. Commercial uses such as an auto or RV sales are not allowed under the current agreement. We had a potential tenant with Coeur d'Alene Taxi. This was last spring, I think it was. They were interested in potentially using the site as their dispatch center office, but that didn't fit. We ran that past the staff, and that didn't fit under the CZDA. And so, you know, John's been working for, I don't know, 8 to 10 months now to try and find a quality tenant for the site. And he's not been successful in finding that. And I think John can address that a little more when he gets up to speak. But we're with the restrictions in the CZDA, we just, you know, haven't been able to find somebody that fits in well in that site. Shifting gears a little bit, in 2019, well, we watched with some interest when the property across the street that's owned by Huetter Properties LLC, it went through the same process that we're going through now. They were successful having the CZDA removed for that property. And the similarities and differences between that case and this one make for an interesting discussion. I won't go through that in great detail, but I do have the order of decision for that case I'd like to present to you.
That'll be entered as HE 1002.
And I'd ask that you primarily review the staff analysis section of that, and contrast that with what the staff has recommended in this case. And that's not far from wanting to disparage the current staff. They're in a tough spot. The city of Coeur d'Alene has put them, I think, you know, has given them a tall order of, you know, steering this away from approval. But I would contrast a little bit here. That prior case, obviously there are some differences. That is in the Post Falls exclusive tier area of city impact, and we're on the Coeur d'Alene area of city impact. But interestingly, the exclusive tier ACI is actually meaningfully more restrictive when it comes to zone changes than the Coeur d'Alene side is. And Coeur d'Alene's ACI is really pretty Spartan with regard to any substantive requirements other than the right to comment on applications. So I just ask that you please take 2 minutes to review that before you write your recommendation. The city of Coeur d'Alene and staff are strongly encouraging annexation for this property. And we're not opposed to annexation, but the reality is that it currently is not a viable option for this property, and it's because of the sewer issue. Let me take you on a field trip here. The star is where the closest sewer line is for the city of Coeur d'Alene. It's not that far away, but it's not accessible to us because for all of that, it requires an easement across either the Huetter property or across some property, some private property in this residential subdivision. And we don't have an easement to get at that sewer line. I'm also informed from an engineer friend of mine who is familiar with this area that it can't be brought up Celtice and up Huetter because there's no room to bring it through underneath the bridges that are there. There are too many other existing utilities a sewer line will not work, cannot be brought through that area and have it meet standard. And so we don't have access to the city's sewer, to the city's sewer system until the Huetter property moves forward. And so this is the phasing plan for Huetter, and that was, this was just annexed last year. And it will likely, you know, they will eventually, you know, bring sewer into there. It will likely be in road right of way. We'd be able to bring it out to Huetter Road and bring it down to the property and so on. But Huetter, phase one, they start on the north end of their project. Our site is down here. And this distance from here to our site, that's 1 mile. That's how big that Huetter project is. So that's a mile. Well, we can't run sewer, you know, it's economically infeasible for us to run a sewer line for a mile down Huetter Road to service one parcel. And so that's phase one. And they expect that, you know, that's where they start. They're working on, as Vlad indicated, they're working on their master plan and so on. But we expect that's going to take them several years. They may, you know, do some part of phase two concurrently with that, but we think it's at least several years and perhaps 10 or more years before they get to our neighborhood with any development in that area. Typically, and so again, we don't think, you know, we don't have access to sewer from the city. And typically what the city requires is that they say, look, you cannot do any change of use on the property after you annex until you have connected to you have run sewer to the property and you've connected to city sewer. So that's just kind of a typical requirement for the city. And that actually paints us, if that's the case, that paints us into a smaller corner than we are right now. At least now we can do some similar uses to what North Idaho Maritime was under our current agreement. But if we go to the city, propose a change of use to them, they're like, no, you've got to have sewer. And so we don't think annexing to the city is a really viable option for us. We understand the city's concern. We're not opposed to annexation. We just can't get there from here at the moment. And so what we're seeking with this zone change is removal of the CZDA to allow additional options for interim uses until the property can annex and redevelop with those city services. We believe that is likely. We think when sewer is available to the property, it makes so many more uses available for that property that we think it probably will redevelop once sewer becomes available. But we don't know when that is. You know, we can't spend $1 million to bring it down there for one commercial use. And so we're asking removal of the CZDA in the interim so we can go find an appropriate interim use. If the CZDA is removed, we still have the special notice permit. It's still required for uses at the site. It provides the opportunity to impose conditions. It could include following city standards for street frontage and landscaping improvements to ensure compatibility with.
You are muted. You can mute or.
Did I do that? No. Okay, I just wanted to make sure I didn't hit some button. So, you know, the county can impose, you know, additional landscaping standards and so on through the special notice permit. Could require signing of a consent to annex, like was done on the property across the road. Uses, as Vlad indicated, they are still significantly restricted due to the health district requirements. It's got to be domestic strength wastewater, 250 gallons per day. is what we get. And again, I just ask you to take a look at the staff analysis that was done for the zone change across the street, contrast that to ours. And again, we think the protections exist through that special notice permit process. In closing, I guess I'd reiterate that the adequate protections exist without the CZDA. Let us broaden our search for a quality interim use for the site by removing that CZDA. We hope to find something that can take advantage of the high visibility of the site, something that's a little more aesthetically appealing than the contractor storage yard, which is essentially what it was before. And with that, I would happily stand for any questions you might have. And thank you for your attention. Just go back to that one.
I don't have any questions at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
John, you want to?
Yes, thank you. For the record, John Condon, 8207 North Sally, Hayden, Idaho. So thank you for allowing me to speak today. There's just a couple things I'd like to cover. One is that I'm not here looking for special treatment. I'm just looking for fair treatment under the rules as they exist. I'm looking for some common sense to be applied to this situation here. As it stands, I've had a lot of interest in the property to use it as I used it, as a contractor storage yard and so forth. My goal, our goal for this property is to have a higher and better use for it than that. It has 700 feet of frontage on the freeway. We spent a lot of time, energy, and money to upgrade the facility and to make it more aesthetically pleasing, and we have really changed the whole the view of from the freeway and so forth, because it is so exposed, and it's got a much higher and better use than a storage yard, even as I used it. And that's really our goal. But under the current circumstance, that's not allowable. You would think, and that's why I say with common sense, that a higher and better use would be allowable, but it's not. And I've had numerous opportunities, people come forward to rent it, to use it as I did it. But I really do not want to do that with that property. I would like to be able to have the flexibility to have a higher and better use that would, really benefit what the property has to give. And that's really what we're here to ask for today, is that we just apply some common sense here. I don't want to fill that full of contractor, equipment and goods again. We've just really, like I say, we really made an effort to improve the site so that it could be leased, longer term to a quality tenant there. I don't want a tenant that's not of quality, that is problematic. I want a real high-end quality tenant in there that can use that property and use the visibility to their advantage. And that's, and then the numerous people I've had approach me when I explain to them that I can't tell you whether you can or cannot actually lease it. I have to get a letter from you with your business plan, a letter of interest, then I have to take it to the county to see if they'll allow you to do that. And I can't tell you exactly how long that process is going to take, because it's not quantifiable. And they look at me like I'm nuts. And to me, I'm just trying to get, some parameters put forth so that we have some reasonable expectations what we can or cannot do, who we can market to, and subsequently get a quality tenant in there. And that's what I hope is reconsidered at this point. So thank you for your time.
Okay, thanks. I don't think I have any public comment sheets here. Do you have anybody online?
There's Levi McPhee. There's Levi McPhee online. That's the only person that's not staff. Levi, did you wish to speak to this item?
No, not to this item, no.
Okay, thank you.
You are muted.
I just muted Levi. So that would be it.
Okay. So Vlad, can you speak to the special notice permit?
Once again, for the record, Vlad Finkel with Kootenai County. I do agree with Mr. Wickman that the special notice permit would address the potential impacts associated with the future use of the site. However, we believe that let me backtrack a little bit. I think the reason why the county is on board with the city of Coeur d'Alene versus eliminating the zoning development agreement, it's not only because it's a different ACI agreement. It's the fact that this property is abutting the city of Coeur d'Alene, whereas the other property was not adjacent to any city of Post Falls property. And in that case, because the applicant signed what's called a consent to annex agreement that had specific sideboards, of course, through the special notice permit process, that was not contemplated as part of the zone change agreement. We felt that that was appropriate action. Additionally, I think I'd like to point out that there's been perhaps a change in the interpretation of the code since this zone change was approved in 2014. In 2014, in review of this project as well as Mr. Root's project, which is across the street, the county contemplated or allowed an approval of a zoning development agreement because there was a caveat that perhaps if the site did not generate 50 trips per day off of Huetter Road, which is a public road, that perhaps a special notice permit may not be required, and that the zoning development agreement would serve as a restriction for future use of the site. The latest interpretation that we have in the code, and I think it's slightly different, is that the code has different criteria for requiring a special notice permit. One is the amount of trips that are being generated, and the second one is if the property fronts a state or federal highway, not accesses off of a state or federal highway, because you can't access directly off of a federal highway, but if it fronts it. And so I think the interpretation of the code today, if it was interpreted in the same manner in 2014, perhaps the CZDA would have not been required because we would have said a special notice permit is required regardless of the number of trips that are being generated. So I think that's the distinction. And perhaps if you didn't mind, maybe Mr. Wickman can elaborate on that and see if he's sees eye to eye on that, or if he has a different opinion on the interpretation of a special notice permit.
Okay, I have another question for you. If they had a tenant that is a different use than, slightly different use, that would need to have an alteration done to the conditional zoning permit, is that staff level, director level, or is that a public hearing?
Unfortunately, it's not an administrative decision. A modification to zoning development agreement would still have to go to a hearing. And it would have to go to a hearing examiner first, and then I believe the code states if it is determined that the change in the conditional zoning development agreement is significant, it would have to rise to the level of a board hearing as well. Otherwise, the board could deliberate on the matter. But at least one public hearing would have to be held in front of the hearing examiner. And I do see, and I do realize that Mr. Condon has an issue. He's in a bit of a conundrum because any use that's being brought forward by a potential leasee has to go through our review. We cannot guarantee how long it will take for us to review that, or if it would be considered to be an equivalent use, where they could just go and pursue that and perhaps just do an administrative special notice permit, or if the determination made by our department as well as a legal would be to say that it's a major modification requiring a public hearing. And I do understand where Mr. Condon and Mr. Wickman are coming from. That is the case. So, unless you have any questions, I don't have any additional information for you.
And I think I was the hearing examiner on this one across the street. So I remember that one. And
Slightly different sideboards because of the ACI and being not contiguous with the city limits.
And we also had a user. We knew who the user was going to be.
That's true. They did have a letter of intent that was part of the file that they wanted to expand a plumbing business. But like I said at the beginning of my presentation, this is a very challenging project because there's just no black and white. It was a challenge for us to put together our analysis as well as just advising the applicant on what their options are.
Okay, thanks. Randy, you want to speak to the special permit subject?
Just briefly, and, you know, and again, Rand Wickman for the record, you know, I appreciate all of staff's assistance in this one. You know, the world would be in a lot of trouble if everybody always agreed with me. But the, you know, so we have our differences of opinion, you know, on this one, obviously. I think that, I'm dating myself now, but back in the mid-90s is when this monster called the special notice permit was invented, or it was the late 90s, I think. That might have been the conditional zoning development agreement, and then the special notice permit came along in the early 2000s, whatever it was. But the reason the special notice permit was originally invented was because we were, at the time, requiring conditional zoning development agreements on every rezone to commercial or light industrial or anything like that. And it was, you know, that's what was necessary in order to impose conditions on a rezone. And so we had an applicant come along and propose this special notice permit as a means that we could avoid the conditional zoning development agreement. The special notice permit would be an easier and quicker process, and therefore we wouldn't have to do the conditional zoning development agreement. We could, you know, we had that ability to condition a zone change without a conditional zoning development agreement. And that's how that all started. And so, you know, and obviously things change, and, you know, these things have a way of taking on a life of their own over time. And that's all well and good, but that's why I see the CZDA and the special notice permit as a belt and suspenders approach that really is unnecessary. That I think you can do away with one or the other without any real harm to the county's ability to appropriately regulate these things. And so, again, I appreciate staff's conundrum, you know, but that's our take on it, is that, you know, the special notice permit, amending the development agreement, then we've got to come back and do a special notice permit for a new use. That process is so long that, you know, there are very few tenants out there, when they identify a site, that are going to wait 8 months or 10 months that it takes us to go through the process to get approval for that new use. You know, the special notice permit is a couple, 3, 4 months perhaps. Maybe we could do it quicker, 2 or 3 months perhaps. But that's usually the fringe of the amount of patience that, you know, somebody who's moving into a new commercial site, you know, that's about the amount of patience that they have. They don't have an extra 6 months to wait around and hope that this falls into place for them while we, you know, do the application process through the county. So that is, one of we're trying to peel away one of those layers of review that we feel is unnecessary and extraneous. And we think you can safely do that by eliminating the CZDA.
So you mentioned landscaping restrictions, guidelines, whatever, as something that you would expect potentially in a special notice permit. What other things might you expect?
Depending on the use, it could be hours of operation, could be restrictions on lighting, could be restrictions on the number of employees at the site to comply with health district regulations, consent to annex, requirement that we work something out with the city, on a timeline to annex and that sort of thing. All of those things, anything that you impose on a conditional use permit, for example, is certainly fair game to be included in a special notice permit. It also includes all of the agency review that, normally happen, with the fire district and the highway district and those kinds of things. So in my mind, I'm comfortable that the county has adequate ability through that process to properly regulate any future use here in the commercial zone. But as I said, not everybody always agrees with me.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Vlad, do you want to respond in any way?
I do not. Maybe Director Callahan has some points that he would like to make, but I don't have any information.
Madam Hearing Examiner, I will own that I have a hard time with any upzoning for county property immediately adjacent to a city. Those two things are naturally contradictory in good land use planning practice, as you know better than most anyone. I'm quite sure you've experienced this in other municipalities. Mm-hmm. And so I would, my starting point is that the original CZDA was a camel's nose thing that opened up a little property for some use that wouldn't ordinarily occur. And it's, to me, it's illogical to assume that that very small opening of commercial should now be expanded to all the uses of commercial when it's contrary to good planning practice. This is a property, if it needs to be more intense, it should be in the city, just like everything north of it now is. And it's frankly irrelevant as to whether the timing works for this particular piece for a sewer. That's something the applicant and the city need to work out. In the meantime, in my view, this property needs to have uses that are compatible with the surrounding area in the county.
Okay, thank you very much. That concludes our hearing on case number ZON 22-0006.
Thank you.
Our next case is case CUP 23-0013.
Once again, for the record, Vlad Finkel with Kootenai County Community Development. I promise you that this case is going to be slightly, if not significantly, easier for staff as well as you and the public to evaluate and to consider all of the proposed improvements on the subject site.
Yeah, but my car got a lot dirtier going to visit that site.
Perhaps maybe with the next fee update, you could include a car wash as part of the hearing examiner fees. This is a request, case number CUP 23-0013, public utility complex facility, and this is a request by Kootenai County Water District Number 1. The subject property is located in the Bonanza Ranch area. What the site consists of 3 previously platted lots that were consolidated to eliminate the need for a setback requirement from the interior common lot lines. So it's essentially one lot with one development right that consists of 3 previously platted lots. As you can see, based on the Google map aerial overlay, it's heavily treed, as you know from doing a site visit. It is accessed by Buckboard Road. It's a public road. The site is slightly less than an acre in size, 0.9 acres in size. It is zoned agricultural suburban, and the comp line designation is suburban. What the applicant is requesting is they currently have an existing water storage facility on site to provide domestic flows and fire suppression flows for the area, for its constituents. From reading the applicant's narrative, it states that the use was established in 1963, which predates any of the rules and regulations that the county adopted with the inception of this department in the early 70s. Having said that, I'd like to point out that that makes this use technically non-conforming, legal non-conforming. And what the code states under our non-conforming section of the code is that any existing non-conforming use that is proposed to be improved, enlarged, upgraded, whatever you may call it, needs to be brought into compliance, meaning that it would require a land use permit for it to be appropriately processed to make the existing improvements on site conforming as well as those that are being proposed. So what they currently have is they currently have a storage tank that's approximately 100,000 gallons, as well as 2 smaller tanks that were constructed originally when the facility was built in 1963. Their intent today would be to remove the 2 old reservoirs, retain the 100,000 gallon tank on site, as well as build a large tank that would be a little over 500,000 gallons in size. They do have a stipulation that based on funding, perhaps they may not be able to build it that large, but they want to be approved for a reservoir of that size in case they do have the funds at a later date, that they would not have to come back for a review of whether or not it's a substantial change and requires a condition modification to the CUP. So I think they're doing it just to protect themselves from future review of a land use application. These are some of the photos of the existing improvements on site. So this tank would remain, the smaller ones would be removed. During the agency comment period, we solicit comments from all the agencies with jurisdiction. It appears everybody's on board. We did have a follow-up comment from Idaho Department of Environmental Quality, where they did state that actually they're the ones that are assisting with funding this this upgrade to the system because it's a necessity, and that I think they have done some preliminary review of engineering, but nothing has been finalized. That's why they don't have any specific recommendation or approval of the system because it's currently in the beginning stages, and maybe Mr. McPhee could further clarify on the engineering status of where they are with the system that they're proposing. One of the other comments was from Idaho Department of Water Resources. I believe there are currently 3 different water rights that are issued to this site, and I believe that the proposed improvements must comply with the sideboards or limitations of those water rights. And then maybe Mr. McPhee can further elaborate on that as well, so it doesn't go beyond the scope of what was approved for water right on this site. We did not get any comments in opposition. We find that is a good indicator that this is pretty much everybody in support. Nobody's opposing the upgrade. we find that the proposed improvement will not have a negative environmental, social, and economic impact associated with the proposed improvements. On the contrary, a larger reservoir on site will address the following, which is drinking, water supply, delivery pressure, emergency storage, water supply, and fire suppression needs. And due to lack of opposition, it is clearly evident that the community supports this request. I stand for any questions that you have for me at this time.
Well, I have an oddball question. I had never been up in that area. What's the story with it? Do you know how?
Bonanza Ranch?
Yeah.
It's interesting. Director Callahan probably could tell you a few stories, would take up some time, but in short, that area was platted many years ago. We were saying in the 40s, 50s?
Long before we had code.
Ah,
And unfortunately, because due to lack of regulations at that time, nobody had gone out to do soil analysis to determine the soil conditions and suitability of septic systems in the area, because as I have found out working for the county in the last 15 years, is that a majority of lots in Bonanza Ranch do not meet state regulations for percolation or for a standard subsurface septic system. And so a lot of these parcels are either vacant, some of them do have residences on which obviously the soil conditions met the requirements for a subsurface system, or a lot of times folks have requested a special notice permit for a storage building on site without any sanitary facilities. So it is, I don't know if you would call it like an odd duck type of development, but it does have its nuances. But aside from that, we do think that the proposed improvements are necessary and needed to improve the water supply for its constituents. So
okay,
we support this application.
thanks. Claudia Goff? Yes. Is the applicant in favor, may wish to speak?
I think I will defer to Levi, who's our engineer.
Okay. I don't have a,
He's online.
oh, okay, great. Levi?
Unmute yourself and go right ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, my video and my audio are not aligned, so hopefully I'm speaking at the correct time here. The only comment that I would have,
Levi,
or request that I would have
Would
is...
you give us your name and
Yes.
address for the record, please?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Levi McPhee, and my address is 4221 Holmes Road, Coeur d'Alene.
Thanks. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So my only comment or request would be, as part of the staff report, I read that there's a request that the proposed concrete tank be painted a dark green or brown color. Typically, as best practice, we don't recommend a coating be applied to the outside of these tanks. It primarily leads to development or creation of a long-term maintenance item for the district and doesn't otherwise provide much value from an engineering or water operation standpoint. I would like to request, I guess, that the natural gray color of the concrete reservoir be considered as a neutral tone that's acceptable in lieu of that.
That's for the existing tank that's up there?
No, sorry, that's for the proposed new reservoir.
Okay.
The existing tank is natural concrete, and there's no plan to do anything different with that one.
Because it appears
I guess my request is...
It appears to be quite dark gray.
Yeah, it may be. I don't think that it's a coating. It's probably just aged or old concrete with maybe some moss or vegetation on it.
Okay. But you are proposing with this change that you're going to fence the entire site
That's correct.
and gate it? Any additional vegetation planned?
Not at this time.
And I'm just curious, is there a recycle market for those old World War II tanks?
That's a good question. I know that the district has identified someone that is going to take those. I don't know the details of what that looks like. I don't know if Claudia can speak to that or not, but there is an interested party for these ones, yes.
Okay, thank you. Claudia?
Thank you.
Do you want to add anything?
So my name is Claudia Goff, 7042 East Highview, Coeur d'Alene. Live in the district. I'm the president of the board for the water district. Yeah, we found somebody who was interested in these World War II vintage because they are actually from Farragut originally. They were surplus at Farragut when these things were installed way back when. And they want them, and so they're going to come and haul them away. So
That's great.
We're very happy. All I would just say is I want to thank Vlad for his work and helping us get through this thing. We wrote a letter of support for this. I'm not surprised that there was no public comment in objection to this because a lot of the infrastructure of this water system has been degrading over time. Some of this is vintage 1960 piping, and we have more repairs on it than we have the original pipe in most places. The water storage is an incredibly critical component of the improving this water system for us to meet DEQ's requirements, but also for fire suppression in this area. So I just want to thank the community development for their consideration.
Okay, thank you. And we have William Brizolara,
That's correct.
in favor, does not wish to speak.
I'm in favor. I don't think there's anything I need to add.
Okay, and do we have anyone on Zoom?
None other than Levi. So
Okay.
no.
So if everybody has said their piece, I think we can close the hearing on CUP 23-0013. And that concludes our evening public hearing. Thank you.